Awesome. So, tonight we start the last book of the Torah, which means we're almost done with our study. And I think there's mixed... I know, right? There's mixed feelings, I think, definitely for me and maybe for you, because I really love our time together, but also Tuesday nights. I spend a lot of the day prepping for this, so I'm kind of like, boy, Tuesdays would be nice to have back. But it is a little sad that we're getting ready to finish this up and be in prayer about what might come next. I don't know what it would be, so I'm trying to figure that out. I want to kick off tonight with the email that I sent out last week talking about Eden and the first sin in the Promised Land at Jericho when it caused them to lose the battle at, in Hebrew it would be Ai. We call it Ai because it's easier to read that way. And so the kind of what I was getting at, and I just sort of want to say this to maybe fuel your appetite to think about these type of things and how they line up together. So obviously the first sin in Eden, taking the fruit, like we covered that. It's super well known. I don't really need to say anything about that. In Jericho, this guy named Achan, when the walls of Jericho fell and the city was conquered, they were supposed to take all of the spoil and devote it to destruction, basically. Either devote it to destruction or devote it to the tabernacle, to the Lord. And what Achan does is he finds this gold and this cloak, and he takes it. And the cloak is described in Joshua, I believe it was chapter 6, as a cloak of Shinar. And you know what Shinar is, right? It's Babylon. And so the thing that Achan sees and takes, which is the first sin in the Promised Land that brings death, is, I believe, supposed to be a picture for us of the first sin in Eden that they see and they take, and it brings death. And what that does for me, as I parallel those two things, is it gives me a deeper understanding of what Babylon pictures by comparing it to the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil in Eden. I know we haven't studied Joshua together, but I just sort of sent that out this week as a way to interpret Scripture with Scripture and think about where have I seen this pattern before. So I think that's really great. Tonight, we start the book of Deuteronomy. In Greek, we get our name, Deuteronomy, from Greek. Deutero, it means two or second, and nomos is the Greek word for law. In Hebrew, the book is called Ele Hadavarim, which means these are the words, simple, which I think is a much cooler name. Because it's either second law or these are the words, which I think is it's more powerful. It puts weight on what we're about to read.
Is that Devarim?
Davarim. Hadavarim.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, from davar, which means word or to say. Yeah, there you go. So with that in mind, these are the words. We're going to kick off our video to give us our introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. So we can take that away, Fred.
The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to them. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here that the design and purpose of the book unfolds. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches from Moses where he's calling the next generation of Israel to be faithful to the covenant with their God. At the center of the book is a collection of laws, which are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Some of the laws are new, but many are repeated from the laws given earlier at Mount Sinai. And that's actually where this book gets its name, from a Greek word, deuteronomion, which means a second law. Now, surrounding these laws are two outer sections of Moses' speech. Each of these are broken up into two parts themselves. Let's just dive in and we'll see how this whole thing works. So Moses, first of all, summarizes the story so far, and he highlights how rebellious the previous generation was, in contrast with God's constant grace and provision in the wilderness. And God did bring his justice on them, yes, but he did not abandon his covenant promises. After this comes a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were to the covenant. He reminds them of the Ten Commandments, and then the centerpiece of this section is a famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say, obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they will become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says how. Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel is about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation. The sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for the poor. So for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors. And it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so too, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden laws that seem harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law. And you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9. And he quotes a law from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and the ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him." But then Moses says this. He says, "I know that after I die, you're going to rebel and turn away from God and end up in exile." Which is kind of a downer. But then again, he's been with these people for decades, and it becomes clear that his hopes are not very high. But all is not lost, Moses says. One day, when Israel is sitting in exile at any point, Moses says, they can turn back to their God, who will, in his words, circumcise your hearts so that you may love him with all your heart and soul and live. Now, this is a vivid metaphor that's saying something is fundamentally wrong with Israel's heart. It's stubborn and hard. And it's the same thing wrong with the heart of all of humanity. This is going all the way back to the rebellion in the garden. Humans seized autonomy from God. They wanted to define good and evil for themselves, and they ruined God's good world as a result. But one day, Moses says, God is going to do something to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly listen to and love God from the heart and be led back to true life. And this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then a blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.
Cool, I hope that, oh, there's more people than when I went over there. I hope that is helpful in thinking about Deuteronomy. So what we're looking at tonight is we're going to look at those first 3 chapters that are sort of a review, and then we're going to look at the next 3 chapters which are not a review and I think are much more interesting and exciting. So I'm going to spend, by comparison, a lot less time in the first 3 chapters. So if I move over something really quickly that you wanted to talk about, feel free to stop me. I'm going to kind of move quickly over the first 3 chapters. So it starts off with, these are the words. So there's your title of the book in Hebrew. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness. Remember, where are they camped right now? Kind of over across the Jordan River from where Jericho is, right? So they're camped there in the plains of Moab. And he talks about how it was 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. You remember that Kadesh Barnea is the place where Israel was camped when the spies went up into the land. So what he's doing is he's sort of retelling the story. Why would he be retelling the story?
Because the second generation doesn't know it.
Yeah, because this is what happened to their parents. This isn't what happened to them. So he's saying, let me retell this whole story of everything that your parents went through. And he goes through going to Kadesh Barnea. He talks about how they appointed leaders of the people, which I think is important in his context because he is getting ready to turn the nation over and wants them to understand why the leadership structure that is in place is there so that they can imitate it going forward, so that they don't just go, well, this was a dumb way to do things and do something completely different. And it really is kind of a wise sort of transfer of leadership that's happening. And then he talks about Israel's refusal to enter the land. He wants the second generation to understand the sin of their fathers. Ideally, I think what's going on here is so that they wouldn't repeat it. He says, what verse am I looking for here? The disobedience of the fathers. Okay, there were Anakim there, right? You remember that story. What are the Anakim? Giants. Nephilim. Do you remember we talked a lot about Nephilim. You remember what's going on there? The sons of God and the daughters of man. But don't be afraid of them, because Yahweh, your Elohim, who goes before you, will himself fight for you just as he did in Egypt, before your eyes and in the wilderness, where you have seen how Yahweh, your Elohim, carried you, as a man carries his son, all the way that you went until you came to this place. Yet, in spite of this word, you did not believe Yahweh, your Elohim, who went before you in the way to seek you out a place to pitch your tents in fire by night and in cloud by day to show you what way you should go. And Yahweh heard your words. He was angered, and he swore that no one from that generation would go in. So, it goes on for 30, is this chapter, 38 years? Was that in here or the next chapter? Where it said, do not You returned and wept before Yahweh, so you remained at Kadesh many days. Okay. So, any questions on chapter 1? It's a review. It's just a story. Moses is telling a story. And I don't really feel like I have much to teach because it's just a story. It really sort of teaches itself. I had a note on verse 39. Oh yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. And as for your little ones, so Moses is telling about the time when he was talking with the fathers about them, and he says, who you said would become prey, and your children who today have no knowledge of good or evil. I think that's really interesting that he says it that way. What do you think that means to us? It's the return to Eden. Yeah, definitely is the return to Eden. What does it mean about their status in Eden?
They're innocent.
They're innocent. So the second generation, the ones who you said would be prey, they're the ones who actually belong in the land. We'll see that change as the story goes on. But right now, they're the ones who belong in the land. Chapter 2. So from there, we turned and we journeyed in the wilderness the direction of the Red Sea, as Yahweh told us. And for many days, we traveled around Mount Seir. And then we went northward, and we passed through the territory of Esau. And we weren't allowed to take any of the land of Esau, because God gave it to Esau, right? And what's the territory of Esau? Edom. There you go. Perfect. And then, so from Edom, we went and we turned to Moab. And the Lord said, don't harass Moab or contend with them in battle. So we weren't allowed to take any of the land of Moab. And if Edom comes from Esau, and Esau is the brother of Jacob, where did Moab come from?
Lot.
From Lot and his daughter. Yep, you guys are on the ball. So from the time of leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the brook Zered was 38 years, until the entire generation had perished from the camp, as Yahweh had sworn to them. For indeed, the hand of Yahweh was against them to destroy them from the camp until they had perished. Yes. What happened in here in verse 10? That Emim formerly lived there. The people great and many, as tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim. But the Moabites call them Emim. The Horites also lived in Seir, but the people of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and settled in their place, as Israel did to the land of their possession, which Yahweh gave to them. A couple things just happened. Notice how the ESV puts this in parentheses, and I think that they noticed something. Number one, oh no, what just happened? There we go. As Israel did to the land of their possession. This is Deuteronomy, which is before Joshua. So Israel has not done that to the land of their possession. So we've talked before about postscript editing. I hope you're thoroughly comfortable with that idea by now. It seems like someone far in the future, or maybe near in the future, or at some point in the future, came back and put a little edit into the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. Is that okay? You're comfortable with that? We've talked enough about that. You'd be surprised. Like if I said that on a Sunday morning, people would be like, "But infallibility," and want to fight me for it. To be clear, I don't think that makes Scripture not infallible. We're clear on that? Okay, cool. So what are the Emim or the Rephaim? Nephilim. Yeah, and it is, if anything. So you know how we talk about how every culture has a flood story? What this is showing us is that other cultures outside of Israel have Nephilim in their histories. Like they also had to fight with giants. It wasn't just David and Goliath, but the Moabites had to kick out the Emim and the Rephaim, and the people of Esau had to kick out the Horites. And if we go down into verse 20, the Zamzumim. Right down here. The Ammonites call them Zamzumim, and they were also Rephaim, and they were like the Anakim, and so there you go. So this is some other cultures, and the Avim in verse 23, the Avim who lived as far as Gaza, and you know where Gaza is, the Gaza Strip. Well, that's the land that the Philistines possessed even into the time of David. That's where Goliath is from. And so the Avim who lived in villages as far as Gaza, these are likely going to be the predecessors to Goliath. And the people from Kaftor came and destroyed them and settled in their place. Well, obviously they didn't destroy them good enough. They must have kicked them out instead. So it's just really cool. It kind of gives us a little bit of a backdrop to some other cultures and how they also were dealing with this issue that's written about in Israel's history.
What does that common I-M at the end of a name mean?
Yeah, great question. So if I just click on this word right here, Rephaim, and I look at the root word, it's Rapha, and it means person, deity, or group. It means giant. Rapha means giant. When you add to so this is it's a masculine plural suffix. So Hebrew uses prefixes and suffixes. It smashes a bunch of words together. It's just the way it works. If you have a masculine word and you want to make it plural, you add it's a hirak yod mem, like an I-Y-M, so it gets that im sound on the end. So it's a way to take a singular word and make it plural, in short.
So that's more than one of them.
Exactly. It's kind of like our English S, but a lot more complicated because there's different suffixes for feminine words and different suffixes. It looks a little bit different on nouns than it does on verbs and all kinds of things. Cool. All right.
Plural. And this is where you said El versus Elohim.
Exactly. So El would be singular.
Multiple gods.
Elohim would be multiple, but it is the one word that oftentimes isn't translated as multiple. When it's very clear that Elohim is being used to talk about Yahweh, then they just assume what's called the
Singular, plural.
no, it's called the a plural of majesty is what they call it. Because it's referring to Yahweh, we use a plural word, and it's speaking of his majestic nature. You look like you want to say something.
Well, on the eam, some translations won't say something like refine, they'll put rephites or something.
Uh-huh.
So now you can be not confused when you see that in different translations. It says, do we
Rephites.
make it, do we use the Hebrew sounding thing, or do we make it more like English?
Exactly. Exactly. So the same is true with Nephilim, which we talked about before. Nephal, NFL means to fall, fallen, and then the eem makes it plural, so you have fallen ones. Is the most direct way to interpret Nephilim, would be fallen ones. What else did I want to say here in chapter 2? Oh, verse 25. This day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you on the peoples who are under the whole heaven, who shall hear the report of you and shall tremble and be in anguish of you. That sounds to me like exactly what Rahab says when the spies show up in Jericho, right? We heard of you and we heard of your defeat of Sihon and Og. Well, he says, today I'm going to begin to put the dread and fear on you. Well, look at what the next thing that happens is the defeat of Sihon. So it's through the conquering of these two kings, Sihon and Og, that the fear of the nation of Israel is put on the Canaanite people who they're going to conquer. And we see that really clearly in Joshua when the spies are speaking with Rahab. So Sihon. So they passed through the land of Edom. They weren't allowed to conquer anything. They passed through the land of Moab, and they weren't allowed to conquer anything. But look at the difference here. When they go into the land of Sihon, they say, let me pass through your land. I'll only go by road and turn aside neither right or left, and I'll give money for whatever water I drink. Only let me pass through on foot, just like Esau and the Moabites of Ar did for me until I go over the Jordan. Sorry, my logos, I keep clicking on things, and stuff keeps popping up. But Sihon, the king of Heshbon, would not let us pass by him, for Yahweh, your Elohim, hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate. Who does that sound like?
Pharaoh.
It's Pharaoh. But he might give him into your hand as he is this day. And Yahweh said to me, behold, I have begun to give Sihon and his land over to you. Begin to take possession, that you may occupy his land. And so they captured all the cities, the livestock they took as spoil, they plundered the cities, and then, we'll talk about that in the next chapter, but who got this land? Who got the land of Sihon and Og?
Reuben and
Gad.
Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, there you go. So from Sihon, then they turned and went up to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out to battle against us. And Yahweh said to me, don't fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land into your hand. That sounds exactly like what we just read from chapter 1 about the giants. Don't fear them, for I've given them into your hand. And so, I think that what we're beginning to get in the story of the 12 spies who go into Canaan and the bad report that 10 of them bring back, and the defeat of Sihon and Og is a sort of a contrast between the two generations. God told the first generation, don't fear the people, I'm going to give you victory over them. And he's proving it to the second generation, the same exact thing, so that they would believe what God said, so that they could go in and conquer the promised land. And so he gives them this evidence that he's able to bring them victory. And so they defeat Og, and they took possession of the land, and here it is, I gave it to Reuben and to Gad. I gave it to Reuben and to Gad, all this land that we conquered, and the rest of Gilead, I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh, and we know all this. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I just wondered why the second generation, who didn't have, let's say, the best parents, I mean, because they hadn't obeyed, why did they obey when their parents didn't? What happened between these two generations, where all of a sudden they believe in their parents? That's strange to me, because the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. You'd think they would be just like their parents and say, no.
They got tired of camping.
So that's they got tired of camping. You never get tired of camping.
A lot of time had passed.
A lot of time, 38 years.
Yeah, so think about this. Think about the cycle in terms of when they cross over the water. So the first generation goes through the Red Sea, and Paul in 1 Corinthians compares this to baptism. The second generation goes through the Jordan. Before the first generation could go through the Red Sea, they had to have the obedience to trust that Moses was going to lead them out under the leadership of this new God who they didn't know. And they did. They get past the water, and they start disobeying.
Right.
And then the consequences happen. The first generation, we're not past the water yet. We're still in that sort of the plains of Moab, and think of the chiasm of the Torah. We're in the metaphorical Egypt of the second generation. They have not been led by Joshua, instead of Moses out of Egypt, by Joshua into the promised land. And we're still in that, or not conquering, but exodus from Egypt part of the story.
Pretty rebellious.
So we're going to go over the water, and then we're going to get into Joshua, and what we kind of opened up with and talked about this week in the email, they are going to do exactly what their parents did, and the cycle is going to continue. Yeah. Oh boy, Israel. Yeah. Okay, this is where 21 and 22. So, and I commanded Joshua at that time, your eyes have seen all that Yahweh, your Elohim, has done to these two kings. So will Yahweh do to all the kingdoms into which you are crossing. You shall not fear them, for it is Yahweh, your God, who fights for you. It's exactly that same phrasing and what's going on there. And here's what Moses says next. So this is how Moses concludes the summary story of the wilderness wandering from the time that they left Sinai, went to Kadesh Barnea, didn't enter the land. This is what he says. And I pleaded with Yahweh at that time, saying, "Oh, Adonai, Elohim, you have only begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand, for what Elohim is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Please let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, the good hill country, and Lebanon." But Yahweh was angry with me because of you.
That a lot.
Not
It says that a lot.
He does, yep. So this is all your fault, Israel. I didn't do anything wrong, and Yahweh was angry with me because of you. You know what this reminds me of? It's the woman you gave me, Lord.
Yeah. Deflection.
Right? It's that pattern. Okay, so I go up this mountain, then I looked westward and northward and southward and eastward. Look at it with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan. And then y'all have read Matthew 17 recently, the Transfiguration. Who shows up on the mountain?
Elijah and Moses.
Elijah and Moses. Where are they? Well, they're on the other side of the Jordan.
Yeah, Prisca.
That's pretty cool, right? So Moses doesn't get to go over the Jordan. until Jesus comes, and then he doesn't seem, I mean, there's not much said about anything that he says in the story, but I don't get the impression that he's that blown away that he's on the other side of the Jordan. It's more that he's there with Jesus, which I think is pretty cool. Because where Matt talked about this on, what day is today? Tuesday. Matt talked about this on Sunday, about the holding place of Old Testament saints before the resurrection of Jesus. Where has Moses been this whole time?
Yeah, the bosom.
He would be in Abraham's bosom, waiting for the resurrection of Jesus, because Jesus, Colossians says, is the firstborn from the dead. Moses is not the firstborn from the dead, so he would have to go here and wait for Jesus to die, be resurrected, and he is one of the captives led out of captivity by Jesus. But he seems to get a sneak peek, him and Elijah, before anyone else do, which is pretty cool. I mean, there's more to talk about there, and there's other questions about, like, why does Elijah go up if the Abraham's bosom is down and all these things, but that's beyond me. So,
I like 26 where God says, that's it, shut
Yep.
your pie hole.
yeah, that's where I was going next. Enough from you, do not speak to me of this matter again. Yeah. Actually, thank you for bringing it up, because my eyes skipped right over it. Yeah, that's great. Don't bring it up again, Moses. So Moses can't go in. So that's the then. Moses spent the first 3 chapters of Deuteronomy talking to the second generation. This is all the things that led up to us being camped right here in the plains of Moab, and I'm not allowed to go in because of you guys, so you better not mess this up. Kind of is how I sort of feel it's being communicated there. So chapter 4 begins with "and now." So you have the then and you have the now. So chapter 4 is the now. And it says, Moses commands obedience. That's what the ESV title there says. "And now, O Israel, listen," which, by the way, is Shema. So you saw in the intro video, they talked about Shema. We're going to talk about Shema more later. Specifically, the Shema. We're talking about Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and 5. That's what we talk about as the Shema. I think that the message of chapters 4 through 11 seems to all be very unified. And it all sort of fits into this same message as the Shema. So I like to think you have the Shema, and I don't want to bring any confusion that the Shema is something other than Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. But when we look at the whole message of Deuteronomy 4 through 11, it sort of is like the bigger Shema. The whole teaching on, or an expanded sort of teaching on that little piece within it. So he says, listen, Shema, listen to the statutes and the rules that I'm teaching you and do them. And what happens if you do them? You'll live, and you'll go and take possession of the land that Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, is giving you. You shall not add to the word that I command you or take away from it. So you New Testament scholars, does that remind you of anything? Yeah, the end of Revelation. There you go. I lost my place. That you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your God that I command you. Your eyes have seen what Yahweh did at Baal Peor. For Yahweh your God, your Elohim, destroyed from among you all the men who followed the Baal of Peor. And by the way, Baal is the Hebrew word for, master, but really more specifically husband. So I like to think of that as like the men who followed the husband of Peor instead of the husband of Israel, right? Because the Mosaic covenant is this marriage contract between God and this nation that he's making his wife. And so what they did is they went after a different husband. Okay? So New Testament scholars, Matthew 19, what is the one reason that Jesus says that provides allowance? It doesn't make it okay and it doesn't make it good, but it provides allowance for divorce. It's sexual immorality. What the nation of Israel has done is committed sexual immorality against God. Does that make sense? Pretty bummer. Pretty big bummer. What's going on here? But you, who held fast to Yahweh your Elohim, are all alive today. See, I have taught you statutes and rules as Yahweh, my Elohim, commanded me that you should do them. And this is, you had a little bit of a transition in speaking there. So it went from your God to Moses is now saying my God instead of your God. But talking about the same God. I thought that was weird. I didn't know why he did that. So I thought I'd bring it up. Maybe someone had a thought. But we'll keep going. That you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of. Keep them and do them. I love this verse because remember, the whole law up to this point has been super about other nations and bringing other nations into this kingdom of God, and the law not being just for Israel, but being evangelistic, right? He says, keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So what's the evangelistic result of Israel keeping the law? It's other nations seeing their wisdom and seeing their understanding, and presumably seeing Yahweh through that, right? For what great nation is there that has an Elohim so near to it as Yahweh, our Elohim, is to us whenever we call upon him? You see now why I labored so much in Genesis to separate in our minds the difference between Yahweh and Elohim, because that line doesn't make sense if we're reading the Bible monotheistically. It just is nonsense. Because what nation, if there's no other God, then no nation has a God so near to it. But when you have that understanding of there are other gods, it puts emphasis on the love of Yahweh for Israel and the nearness of Yahweh to Israel that Peor does not have with Baal, and that Canaan does not have with Molech. I might have mixed that one up. I think he's Mesopotamia. But you understand the message that I'm saying. And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this Torah that I set before you today? Only take care, keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen. I'm going to skip over this section because it's really going to be repeated in chapter 6. And I think in chapter 6 it's going to emphasize the forgetting and the remembering in a really, really cool way that I find to be very applicable to us today. In verses 27 through 30, I'm going to jump down here. So, if you act corruptly by making carved images in any form, by doing what's evil in the sight of Yahweh your God, what's he going to do? 27, and this is really just Leviticus 26, right? He says, and Yahweh will scatter you among the peoples. When does that happen?
AD 70. Syria.
Ooh, 87,
That's the
yes.
second time, but Assyria.
Assyria is the one I was looking for, yeah, but 80, 70 as well. Yeah, 722 BC, the Assyrians come in and scatter the northern 10 tribes. And you will be left few in number among the nations where Yahweh will drive you. And there you will serve gods of wood and stone, the work of human hands, that neither see nor hear nor eat nor smell. Which is, I just love the irony in this statement. If you make a carved image, I'm going to send you to nations to worship carved images. It's like God is saying, I'm going to give you over to exactly the thing that you want to worship. If you want to worship something other than me, I'm just going to let you do it.
Sounds
Right?
like Romans 1.
It's Romans 1. That's exactly, Paul has this exact thing in mind as he's writing Romans 1, yeah. But from there you will seek Yahweh, your Elohim, and you will find him. Wait, are you saying that our fate is determined and we're going to be scattered? Because it was conditional, wasn't it? If you make these carved images, then I'm going to send you out. And then he says, from there you will seek Yahweh your God and find him and search after him with all your heart and with all your soul. And when you're in tribulation and all these things come upon you in the latter days, you'll return to Yahweh your Elohim and obey his voice. So is the destiny of Israel predetermined?
Predicted.
I think he knows what it's going to be.
Yeah.
Not predetermined. I think he just knows what's going to happen. Right.
I also think he knows what's going to happen. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think it goes a little bit beyond that. And to me, people always want to argue about Calvinism and Arminianism and all these things that we don't need to get into in any way, shape, or form. But what I think is really cool about this is that it seems like Israel's disobedience is predetermined, that they're going to be disobedient and they're going to be sent to other nations, and that in no way takes away their choice of obedience or disobedience. And I think that those two things have to go together. Because you get to a chapter like Ephesians 1, where Paul goes on and on about election and predestination and all these things, and people get all wrapped around the axle because they're not reading Paul in light of the Old Testament when Paul was writing in light of the Old Testament. And that our predetermination and our election in no way takes away choice. And we like to really just draw hard lines in the sand about these doctrines, and the reality is, like, God is big enough for both to be true. And I think that that is so much better than fighting about it. Yeah, go ahead.
So is that like the whole chicken and the egg thing? Like what comes first? Them deciding to be disobedient and then God say again. Yes.
Predetermined.
Predetermined.
Yeah.
Or did
Or
God?
predestined.
You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? Like is it
I do know what you're saying. So which came first?
right? Their decision in their heart, or God saying you will do this so that you will turn towards me?
Okay, so go back to Eden.
Yeah.
So which came first? Was it disobedience that came first?
Or you mean first to cause the exile? Then yes.
What I mean is, which came first? The disobedience of man or the plan of God to redeem man out of their disobedience?
Right.
Oh.
That's what I'm saying.
Because the Lamb was slain before the foundation of the world, right? But Adam and Eve didn't sin before the foundation of the world. So was Adam and Eve's sin predetermined?
Just known.
I think it was just known. I mean, we're talking about a universe without time,
Mm-hmm.
where everything is, it's really hard to imagine not having time.
Sure.
But if you don't have time and everything exists all at the same time, then predestination doesn't really play into it, because, or it is, everything is predestined. You can kind of see it both ways. I think God knew what people would do, and I think part of His plan was based on knowing what we would do.
Mm-hmm.
So wait, can you go back to the lamb was slain before the foundation of the world? Did you say that? Is
Yeah.
that-
That's let me look up the reference
Yes,
for you.
Because that changes everything.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Slaying 7 horns. Okay, hold on. It's gonna take me. Yeah, just Google it. I mean, you might find it faster than I do. All right, let's see here.
Revelation 13:8.
What?
Okay. Okay. Let me pull up a different version here.
I have King James version, lamb slain from the foundation.
From the foundation of the world. The ESV translates it differently. It puts the foundation on the writing of the name in the book rather than the slaying of the lamb, which you said King James version?
Yeah, King James.
Let's see here. Why is it not on their Bibles?
I guess that kind of means the same thing.
Sorry, I'm having an issue.
Okay,
here.
I'm speculating.
Okay, Revelation 13:8. This is New King James. All who dwell on earth will worship him whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And there's a note here that says Matthew 25. I'm blessed by my Father and inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. That doesn't really help us. Yeah, that didn't answer your question at all, did it?
No, but I feel like if we go to the original language will say whether it's from, because some of these translations even omit that part, who was put to death. Like,
Yeah.
if you look at, like, I don't know, the basic English Bible, it doesn't even,
Okay, I have bogged us down in details.
Yeah, so, yeah. But seriously though, if that is the case, if that is the truth, that means that happened first.
Mhm.
The plan for redemption happened before the need for redemption?
Yes, but don't you think that could be because the Lord knew that this was going to happen?
Oh, definitely.
Or because there's no such thing as time. We have to have linear
Yes.
time, and they didn't invent time until he invented the world. So everything was going to happen anyway.
Yeah. Well, you could really go off the rails with this conversation very quickly. I did set aside a little bit of time for this, but we're gonna come back to it when we hit Deuteronomy 28 and 30, more towards the end of Deuteronomy. It's gonna take this idea and expand it, and so I'm wondering if maybe we come back to this.
One more, I mean, given that we already had the exile from Eden,
Yep.
I think you can argue now that this is guaranteed. I think in Eden, perhaps it was a toss-up. There might be a question. Okay, will they blow it? But they did, and that sets the template. And these people are the progeny of that original sin. They're stuck with it, and he can say, "Yeah, you're going to do it again. Sure, you are,
Yeah.
because that's your mommy and daddy, and you're going to repeat their sin."
There are scholars who will take it both ways, whether Eden's a toss-up or not. So there's lots of people out there who are going to disagree with you on that.
Well, I'm not saying it is or isn't. I'm just saying, I think in this instance here, I think we can definitely argue that because they're the children of Adam and Eve who sinned, they will sin and they'll blow it. Guaranteed.
That's where I stand. But there are a lot of people, because I'm seeing this as God is foreknowing. We can say predestining or we can say foreknowing the sin of Israel. But he's also foreknowing their repentance and return from exile. And making a way for that return from exile before they even go into it, which I think is very meaningful when it comes to how we think about the gospel, in that our mode of approaching God was put in place before I even needed it.
Yes.
And God knew that I would need it.
I agree.
That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Without choice, we can't love. So he
Yep.
had to give his choice, knowing all of this was going to happen.
Yep, I agree with that. Totally agree with that.
And can I just say one other thing?
Definitely.
So if it's an either or and it's not an and, so I believe it's probably an and. If it's an either or, then we can even look at the whole God relenting on the mountain. Like, why would he, if it was one or the other? You know what I'm saying? Like
I do know
how,
what you're saying.
then the whole relenting thing doesn't even exist.
Yeah. Or it becomes even more important.
Well. Okay.
Cool. It's a great conversation, and it really is a mind bender, because it's one of those things that's just like, man, God's ways. We know that God's ways aren't our ways, and this is one of those times where I'm like, God's ways are so much not our ways that I can't even grasp it. So I'm going to jump down to verse 32. For ask now of the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that Elohim created man on the earth. And ask from one end of heaven to the other whether such a great thing has ever happened or was ever heard of. Did any people ever hear the voice of Elohim? ESV decided this one was lowercase God. Did any people ever hear the voice of Elohim speaking out of the midst of the fire, and as you have heard and still live? Or has any Elohim ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials or signs or wonders or war by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and great deeds of terror, all of which Yahweh, your Elohim, did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Okay, so 32 through 34 all imply that there are other gods and other nations have those other gods, right? Verse 35. To you it was shown that you might know that Yahweh is Elohim. There is no other besides him. Okay. So is there just one God, or is there a lot of gods?
Just one
I think there's
real
only
one.
one creator.
There's only one real.
There's only one real one. What'd you say?
Yeah, there's only one real God. So he's saying they have gods,
Mhm.
they're fake.
Sure. I wouldn't say they're fake.
Well, they're not.
They're wood and stone.
But that's not what
Can't
they're,
speak, they
that's
can't
not
hear.
what
He's
they're talking
saying all the
about in the
things that
script.
he's done.
Mhm.
Those other gods do that?
They didn't do that. But then in verse 35, he says, and there's only one Elohim. But all the previous verses to it imply that there's not just one Elohim.
Well, that means Elohim means more than one thing.
What's that?
That means Elohim means more than one thing.
So remember, what in effect are the other nations worshiping? Are they worshiping nothing? Just
No.
stone and wood? Or is there things behind the stone and wood?
There's things behind
Well,
it.
Paul would tell us in 1 Corinthians that sometimes it is just stone and wood, but still don't participate in that worship because sometimes there's things behind it. He says there's many lords and many gods. He's using theos and kurios to talk about how there are things that are just stone and the people are dumb for worshiping it, but then there's other things that are things that have power and that can do things to you. So don't participate in worship of idols. And so, in essence, what these other nations are worshiping, thinking that they are gods, they are worshiping thinking they're gods because they're gods. In the sense that gods, in Hebrew, Elohim, means anything more than physical, something supernatural, right? And there are lots of supernatural things. There are lots of gods in the Hebrew mind. In fact, the word is even used for Samuel's ghost by the witch of Endor. You remember that story? It seems to me that they're worshiping spiritual things, but there is one spiritual thing that created all the other spiritual things. So it's not that there's not other gods. It's that the things that they're worshiping as gods might have power, and they might be worshiping them because they've shown their power, but when it's compared to Yahweh, there's no one besides Yahweh, right?
But Ben's kind of right, because even if they're demons, they are still fakers.
That's what I
Yeah,
was saying, like,
yeah.
You can have that conversation, and I had mentioned that, well, then they're demons if they're not God, and you said not necessarily. But I don't remember if that was the last time or the week before.
We've been having this conversation since Genesis. If they're not God, aren't they demons? No, not necessarily, because wouldn't Gabriel be an Elohim?
Yes.
No, he's an angel.
Well,
But
that's
it's
an-
within
that's an
the
Elohim.
Hebrew
Oh, he
category
was in
of
their
gods.
whole Created, well, no, I don't know.
Yeah,
I guess I
yeah,
could
he's
just-
So we could go with the
Yeah.
creator or the created.
So they-
Yeah, the creator or the created. But not all created Elohim are bad. There is
Right.
Gabriel, and who's the other one? I'm thinking of,
Raphael.
who was the prince of
Raphael
Israel?
was the named one.
Is it Raphael? Is that right?
That's a named angel. Good one.
Yeah? Okay. I don't remember. Maybe I'm thinking of something else. Okay.
Michael,
So
yeah.
that's-
Michael, that's the name I'm trying to think of.
So Elohim could be angels. It could be, it's
A
just
spiritual being.
It's the entire category
Right.
of spiritual beings. Yep. And so the sons of God, part of that category of spiritual being going into the daughters of man, we can pretty much assume those were bad ones.
They love
But all Elohim, any Elohim besides Yahweh, isn't necessarily a bad Elohim. In the Hebrew mind, anything that's more than physical, something spiritual, is Elohim. And that, in the Greek mind, they separated into angels and demons. That's not really how Hebrew people thought. Cool?
Yeah.
Okay. I love that. Such a good conversation. Let's go down to chapter 5. We're doing good on time. At the end of chapter 4, Moses introduces the law. In chapter 5, Moses is going to give the Ten Commandments again. And when we think of the Ten Commandments, the first place I think of is Exodus 20. I don't know if you guys are the same, if that's like the one place in your mind, but they show up a second time. They're all the same, except for one. Did you know one of them's different? Go down to verse 12. Now, the law itself is the same. Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy as Yahweh your God commanded you. But it's the only one that from Exodus 20 to Deuteronomy 5, the reason behind the law changes. So, in Exodus 20, let me just go read that. Exodus 20, and we're looking at verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the seventh day and made it holy. So when you practice Sabbath, according to Exodus 20, what are you remembering? You're
Creation.
thinking back to the creation story. Okay. In Deuteronomy 5, I typed it wrong. Deuteronomy 5, verse 13. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh is a Sabbath to Yahweh your Elohim. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant. That all sounds the same. Or your ox or your donkey or any livestock or the sojourner who's within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest, as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt.
Oops.
And Yahweh your Elohim brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore Yahweh your Elohim commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. So according to Deuteronomy 5, what's the purpose for keeping the Sabbath?
Remembering slavery.
To remember coming out of slavery. Which came first? The creation of the world in Genesis 1 or the creation of Israel in Exodus 12?
That's how Moses wrote it.
Well, obviously the creation of the world came first because otherwise there wouldn't be a world for there to be in Egypt for Israel to be in it. But which story came first?
Oh, like when he wrote it.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Because didn't we talk last week about considering if the story of the Bible, if we read Genesis as the prequel, then the story of the Bible starts in Exodus 1, and the revelation of God is not the creation of the world, but the creation of Israel in coming out of Egypt.
So is he saying that supersedes the creation of the world for his story here?
I don't know if that's what he's saying. I don't want to get so definitive as to be dogmatic about that. But I think it's pretty cool that the creation of the world in Genesis 1, if it is written after the exodus of Israel from Egypt, parallels the creation of the nation of Israel. I think that's pretty important. And it probably means, I think, because I'm a proponent for an early Mosaic authorship of Genesis, which means I think that Moses wrote Genesis on Sinai. But I think he probably wrote it after he got the Ten Commandments. Because had he written it before he got the Ten Commandments, then, hold on, let me say this correctly. He's referring, okay, so he must have written it before he got the Ten Commandments because he's referring to the creation of the world in the Ten Commandments the first time, but the creation of Israel in the Ten Commandments the second time. But I think that those stories are so parallel that it's really remembering the same thing, not to us, because we're reading the two different things, but in the mind of an Israelite, that story of God creating the world, I think, is really the story of how God made them into a nation. I feel like I'm losing some people here. I definitely lost Ken Ham, that's for sure. You were going to say something. And then I made a joke.
For me?
Yeah,
No, I was contemplating
saying something.
no. I was trying to digest writing. So,
It's a lot to digest.
John, yeah.
I didn't mean to call on you if you didn't have any.
No,
You looked like you wanted to
I
say
was
something.
clarifying it in my head.
Okay.
So I mean, either way, we observe the Sabbath to remember that the Lord created a home for us.
Totally.
Both ways.
And either way,
Created us.
whether it's the creation of the world or the creation of Israel, the first thing that we learn about Yahweh in the Bible is that he's creative.
Yeah.
And when we look at the Bible as the story that God loves us very much and wants to be with us, then this is the time where we are to be with him for this home that he's created for us with him. And that's the
Yep.
Sabbath.
Yep. And that's the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is rest. Hebrews 4 is super clear about that. And as Deuteronomy goes on and into Joshua, the promised land becomes equivalent to rest, where the thing that God's giving Israel isn't just a land, but is a rest. And it's super cool. Okay.
Is this also possibly like a marker for future generations like us, whereby you can look at this and say, this is a promise to us that we have been redeemed or rescued out of the not rest, and we enter into the Lord's rest because we had been enslaved in the land of Egypt. And instead of saying that, say we were a slave to sin, yet we received the rest of Christ, who now has brought us into that rest.
Bob, have you read Hebrews 4 recently? Because you just quoted it.
Actually, I probably did this morning. Didn't even realize it.
Yeah.
But I absorbed it.
Yeah, it's. I'm just gonna go there real quick because we've got time. Hebrews 4. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to them, talking about the generation of Israelites who got the law. But the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest. And he goes on to talk about, since therefore it remains for some to enter into, those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, not entering the promised land and being afraid of giants. Again, he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward, and the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. This is Hebrews, this is New Testament. But we think of the law, and oftentimes wrongly, that it is just for the Old Testament Jews and it's done away with. But here the author of Hebrews says, the law of Sabbath remains for the people of God. And when do we celebrate it? Should we celebrate it every Saturday?
At least once.
Today. Today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. So the Sabbath rest that we're supposed to celebrate today is not yesterday and it's not tomorrow. And tomorrow it won't be yesterday. It's today. So there you go, man. Hebrews 4, it rocks.
I was talking about this today. Verse 14, the commandment of the Sabbath. It was given also to the stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of how the Jews today use the stranger to do the work for them. So that's in being obedient to the law. They're being disobedient because they're going around the law by asking their Gentile neighbors to turn on their lights.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Yeah, because it's supposed to be for the sojourner as well. Yeah, 100%.
So the Gentile was always part of the plan.
Yes. Yep. And that's the thing that in the New Testament Paul calls a mystery, is how the promise comes to the Gentile as well. And he's going to elaborate on it in Romans 4, around like 6 or 8 or somewhere in there, when he talks about how the promise, how Abraham believed before he was circumcised, so that he might be the father of both the circumcised and the uncircumcised. And he calls that a mystery. He calls it a mystery because, well, he understood it because he was a Jew and a Pharisee and had to have the Torah memorized by the time he was 13. And it feels like a mystery to us because we don't understand the Torah as well as he does. And the people he's writing to don't understand the Torah, so he calls it a mystery. But I'm pretty convinced that if you just go back and read the Torah, it's not really that mysterious. Like, God's trying to reach everybody all the time. And a relationship with God for Gentiles didn't only become available after Christ.
Because you had the court of the Gentiles.
In the temple.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
ignored it, right?
Solomon dedicated it.
Yeah. right.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
Doesn't-
And the 10 lampstands with the
Right.
7 lights and the palm trees have been engraved on the walls. Yeah.
But doesn't Paul also say that and I don't know if I'm reading the context right, but he says you've been grafted in, and I feel
Mhm.
like the first part of that is due to Jesus Christ, which was also part of the mystery, right?
Well, in Romans 11, the first part of the grafting in is due to the disobedience of Israel. It was their disobedience. It was through their disobedience that it also became available to the Gentiles.
Okay.
And he talks about that in the parable of the wedding feast, where a bunch of people are invited and don't show up,
Yeah, yeah.
and then everybody's invited.
So he talks about being grafted in, these writings of the New Testament, but that grafting in happened here within when the Israelites started being, well, actually it happened before that, because they said from the very beginning that how Moses was talking to God about, you can't destroy them. The whole reason was for the nations to come to him, right? Right.
So it happens as a result of Jesus. But remember our time thing, what we're talking about.
Right.
Was Jesus' sacrifice for all the Jews who came before and all the Jews and Gentiles who came after? It wasn't. It's also for all the Gentiles who came before.
Right. Okay.
This is fun stuff. I'm enjoying this. That was really all I wanted to say on chapter 5. I just wanted to talk about Sabbath and how that changes, but not really. Anyone have any more comments on chapter 5? Because we got like 23 minutes to talk about the Shema. And I will fill those 23 minutes with talking about the Shema, just so we're clear. Okay, we're going to go. So, now, this is the commandment. The statutes and the rules that Yahweh, your Elohim, commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear Yahweh, your Elohim, you and your son's son, by keeping all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Shema, therefore, O Israel, this isn't the Shema yet, I was just saying that word in Hebrew because it's like preceding what we're getting to. Therefore, Israel, hear and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you and that you may multiply greatly as Yahweh, the Elohim of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. So here's the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You've heard that 1,000 times. What's it mean to you? You know what it means to me? Nothing. Because it's nonsense. Because everything that we've read up to this point is all about how there's so many gods and all gods in every nation, and now we get to hear and it says there's only one. So I am thoroughly confused by what seems to be the most important passage in the Hebrew mind in the entire Jewish Bible. The thing that is at the centrality of Judaism is just utterly confusing. So, I want to read it in Hebrew.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
I know that you guys can't read this, but we're going to do a little translational work together. Because this one matters. It says, this is the word right here, Shema, Yisrael. This is the Tetragrammaton. It's the word that we say Yahweh. They would never read Yahweh. They would say Adonai. This is Eloheinu. It's the same as Elohim, but you know how I said Hebrew throws suffixes on the end of things. So the new makes it the Lord our God. And then again, the Tetragrammaton, Adonai or Yahweh. And then this last word.
What's that word?
This last word is Echad. And this line in between, Yahweh and Echad, is not a Hebrew character. It was put there because when the Hebrew Bible, this is like even irregardless of translation, because we're not even changing languages, it's just going across time. The people who were translating the Bible into a modernized Hebrew, that word doesn't grammatically fit the rest of the sentence. So they put a line there. It's the Hebrew word echad, it's the Hebrew word for one. But one is a cardinal number. And echad expresses maybe a little bit more of an ordinal number. So first instead of one. But if I go down here to the NRSV and NLT translations, they choose to translate echad into alone. What does Shema mean? You remember the video we watched at the start? Does it mean hear? Let it touch your ears?
Obey.
Listen, obey. I'm going to, so this translation, it's the New Revised John version. This comes from one of my Hebrew professors. Shema, we can translate into something akin to submission in English. So we can say, and in Hebrew, the normal word order does not go noun, verb, direct object, indirect object like English. It goes verb, noun, direct object, indirect object. So the verb comes before the subject of a sentence or before the, now I'm forgetting the grammatical word for the person it's directed at. This is a command. It's directed at Israel. So the verb is coming before the person it's directed at. So I'm going to rephrase this sentence. Israel, submit to Yahweh, your God, Yahweh alone.
Only submit to Yahweh.
Doesn't that change the entire meaning of this verse?
Yep.
Like, because Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is probably the most quoted verse as a proof text for biblical monotheism, and you know how I feel about that. But Israel, submit to Yahweh alone, the only reason Moses would have to say that is if there were other things they could submit to.
Right.
So the writing of the verse, if you read it that way, actually implies polytheism, which seems to line up with everything we've read up to this point.
So why is all this hidden? Why aren't we fixing everything? Why are we fixing it?
Because I'm not a Bible translator, that's
I'm not
why.
talking about you. I'm talking about all of these scholars from all these thousands of years. Why on earth are we just getting these? If people know it but don't translate it, that makes no sense to me.
But it's not that they don't know it, it's that they actually are translating what they believe it means. That John is not like just, hey, really, this is what it means, but everybody else is just faking it.
I know.
There's differing
I'm not saying
opinions
that.
on what it means.
There is. This isn't, maybe me saying this to you now is the first time you're hearing it.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of books out there
Oh.
that
Talk about
develop this exact thing that we're talking about. Lots and lots of scholars, lots and lots of commentaries. I'm not pulling this out of my butt.
Oh, I know that. I'm not saying you are. What I'm saying is, you know it, other people know it, and we're still reproducing Bibles that don't really give you the full meaning. I'm not saying it's wrong or it's like,
I'm going to be a little bit offensive in my answer to this. I think the reason is because most Christians don't care about the real meaning.
That's probably true. I do.
Me too.
So John, could you repeat that whole thing?
Yes.
The way you translate it?
Shema is the word for hear, but can mean listen, obey, submit. So Shema, Yisrael, is Israel. And then the Tetragrammaton is Yahweh, but we say Adonai, but it's Yahweh. Eloheinu is Elohim, but with the pronoun ending to be our God. And then Adonai again. And then the last word is echad, and it's separated by this line because even Hebrew scholars don't think it fits in the sentence grammatically.
Okay, so how did you say it in English?
So I would say, Israel, submit to Yahweh, your God, Yahweh alone.
Okay. Okay.
Yes?
So in Blue Letter Bible, I don't see a line, but I do see between Yahweh and ehud, the last line, it
Uh-huh.
says is in brackets.
Sure.
Would that be the clue?
I think that would be, what version is that?
Blue Letter Bible, I think this is King James Version.
So that would be probably the King James way of trying to make sense of that line.
But there isn't a word for is. They don't
That's
have,
right.
they don't need it. So that's part of the problem is technically what John is saying is legit a translation, but also Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one is a legit translation. These are all, they make sense. So you have to pick it apart and decide theologically which one you think it actually means. Nobody's making up something that they're not making something up that it doesn't fit. All these actually do fit. It's
Well,
'cause
They
they're-
fit the words.
Yeah, they fit the
My
words.
argument is that to say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, doesn't fit the rest of the story.
Yeah.
But that's
They just
interpretation, that's not
Correct.
translation. That's why, I
Correct.
think that's where maybe Petra's getting goofed up.
And I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, go
It's
ahead.
a
Well, but-
difference of interpretation. It's not
Like, I
like,
totally
oh my
get
gosh,
it.
everybody's making up something that doesn't.
Yeah, so let me elaborate on what Carrie's saying, because she's absolutely right. What a translator tries to do is translate from one language to another without applying their own interpretation to the text.
Right.
So if they were to translate it the way that I did, I'm doing a lot of interpretation to arrive at that conclusion. They're trying to do none.
Well, can I just ask really quick? You just pointed out that that's the cardinal number, which.
Could be.
Oh.
Or,
could be.
I think it should be read as an ordinal number because that plays into an interpretation that is logical with the rest of the story up to this point, and how we've talked about the many gods of other nations submit to Yahweh alone or submit to Yahweh first, as in don't put other gods before him.
Right.
Look, yeah, to your point, I mean, if you just say that phrase over and over again, when you first did it, I chuckled because it doesn't make sense to me. If you say the Lord is one, what does that mean?
He's one what?
The Lord is one? The Lord is one? The Lord is, what does that mean? It really doesn't mean anything to me.
You're right. I'm right there with you, Bob.
I mean, is one what? I mean, it doesn't, the Lord is best, the Lord is ultimate, the Lord is optimal,
So
the Lord is the greatest, the Lord is one, the Lord is two, the Lord is three, the Lord is a half. I mean, the Lord is one? What does that mean?
Well, it's often taken in the sense of united, like we are one, like that.
I think that's interpretation.
more
I think
than
it just
we
says
take
the
in
Lord is one,
tradition.
and that means it's nonsensical.
And in that view, in the United view, it's used to support a Trinitarian perspective, which is totally fine because Paul in the New Testament, I can't say goes on and on, but is very clear about the Trinity. He talks about the Father, Son, and Spirit in one verse, not in a way of developing a theology, but in a way that presents God as three persons in one God.
But the Pharisees used it against Jesus, and they pointed at that verse and said, you can't be God because there's one God. The Lord's one. You're not it.
Mhm.
And he's saying, I got a Father, and I and the Father are one, and we're both God. And they're like, no, Shema. The Lord is one.
Exactly. Yeah.
Could I be really obnoxious?
Please.
This is not written in English, so Moses didn't have to choose between one or one united or alone or whatever.
Mhm.
So if you don't have a good reason to exclude one of these interpretations,
Should it be all of them? Is that what you're
could
saying?
it be maybe allowing for more than one possible interpretation being valid? Because it's in Hebrew. God ordained Hebrew to be the language. It's a nice, fun, multi-layered, poetic
Yep.
language. So maybe we don't have to split hairs the way English forces us to, since this isn't English.
Yeah, I was just talking on the way over here with my dad about how I hate the study of Greek because it's just black and white letters on a page and it means what it means. And I love the study of Hebrew because it's so weird and the same word can mean different things in different places and it's just a very fluid. The fluidity of Hebrew is much more attractive to me than the engineering of Greek, if I can put it that way. So yeah, you can. I'm interpreting it the way I'm interpreting it because I don't find other ways to fit into,
The rest of the
verses 1 through
text.
3. If I'm saying that there's one God, then verse 4 contradicts verses 1 through 3. That's where I'm coming from. You can take that or you can leave it. We'll move on. I'm not offended, and neither of us are going to hell, so it's great. So I want to continue our little exercise here of doing a little bit of Hebrew interpretation as we go into verse 5. The next word is va'ahavata, which is a really fun word because it has something on the front and something on the back. The middle is ahava, which is the Hebrew word for love. The thing on the front, the means and the thing on the back, the ta, means you. And so if I read this word in English as close as we can get, va'ahavata, and you shall love Yahweh, your God, Elohecha, b'chol is with all, and then lavav is your heart. This is how the Old Testament thinks of I taught recently about in the New Testament the soma, the pneuma, and the pneuma and what's soul, psuche, and the three parts of a person, right? And the Old Testament kind of does the same thing with the lavav is the heart, and then it goes uvachol and all your nefesh, which is a really cool word because the breath of life in Genesis, all the things in which is the breath of life, is the Hebrew term nefesh chaya. And remember chaya, like l'chaim, right, is the toast to life, l'chaim. So nefesh chaya, the breath of life. So I think if I'm taking that interpretation, applying it here, the best I could do would be and all your breath. But really, it's not just breath that's being conveyed here. If I look at the definitions in Logos, I have throat, neck, breath, living being, there's your nefesh chaya, people, personality, life, soul. And soul, I think, is the one that most versions are going to cling to with all your heart, with all your soul. But it's that nefesh, that like inner life-giving essence of breath, which I think has even more meaning when we know that it's God who put it there in the first place, right? So all your lavav, all your nefesh, uvachol, all your ma'od. Ma'od is your biceps.
Strength.
Not literally. It's your strength. But it's like, it's not just strength as in like, oh, I'm a person, I have strength. It's literally like your physical force that you can exert on something. It's talking about like a gym bro on a protein shake having ma'od, right? So it's like the amount that you can push weights is how much you need to love Yahweh. So those are your three. I think it's so cool.
I like the very bottom definition, with muchness.
With muchness,
Because
that's
it's also
great.
the word you stick on if you're like, and more, or forever. It's like,
Yeah.
it's the more, and, oh,
Yeah, totally.
just-
Like the very, very. And in Choli, they have this word tutual, and it means very. But if you want to say something is like really abundantly great in some aspect, you would just say tutual. So they're just like adding another one, and they're saying like very, very. That's it does that a lot. Yeah, it's the same thing. So yeah, I love that. These words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children and shall talk of them when you sit in your house. By the way, what word are we talking about? What words? He's going back to the Shema, but I'm going to go specifically to the beginning word of verse 5. You shall love Yahweh. So the thing, I think, and you can expand this to be much more than what I'm going to say. I'm really narrowing down here, and I think that maybe I'm narrowing too far, but I'm going to do it to make a point. The love of Yahweh is what you teach your children, and what you talk about in your house, and what you talk about when you walk on the way, and what you talk about when you lie down, and what you talk about when you get up. It's the thing that you bind as a sign on your hand, and it will be as a frontlet between your eyes, the love of Yahweh, and you should write it on the doorpost of your house and on your gate. So a couple things here. This word for hand is the word yad, and look at the first definition there in the word info up at the top of the screen now. It says forearm. It's not just hand like from here up, it's hand like from here up. Okay? That word right there, this is how much of a Pharisee I am, that word is a hava. So I took Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5, and I said, havata, I'm going to take the root word out, it's a hava, and I'm going to put it on my forearm. That's what, if you've ever wondered what my tattoo is, it's Deuteronomy 6, 4, and 5. I put love on my arm. The Pharisees, I'm basically like them, did the same thing and took what's called a phylactery.
Yep.
It's a little box with a little string on it, and they tie it to their forehead, and it had a scroll in it. And you write it on the doorpost of your gates. This word doorpost is the word mezuzot. So if you've heard of a mezuzah, I'm sure some of us have, especially if you've been to Israel, you've probably seen a mezuzah. I know that Jim and Renee Carrick have a mezuzah on the front door of their house. And I'm going to get one when I go to Israel. It's, it looks like, do I have it pulled up? I think I closed that window. But it's like a little piece of metal, and it's got a little paper scroll in it. And the ones that I've seen, the modern ones, have like a hole on each end, so you can just put 2 screws into your doorpost. There's others, like older ones that are kind of on a string that you hang next to your doorpost, and they wouldn't just be on your front door, they would be on the doorpost of like any room that you would live in your house would have a mezuzah on it. Most mezuzahs are like engraved with the Hebrew letter Sheen, which is really, really simple. It just looks like this. And what it stands for is they're just abbreviating the word Shema. It's the first letter of the word Shema. And so it's really, really cool. It's this neat thing.
So are these passed down from generation to generation?
That's the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you tell it to your kids, and your kids tell it to their kids.
So they take the mezuzah today and pass it on to their next generation?
I think if they have a good one, they do.
Yeah.
A lot of mezuzahs today are mass manufactured for tourists like me to go over there and buy from the shops.
Like genuine mezuzahs with the scroll written by a rabbi.
By a rabbi,
Is expensive.
Yeah.
They write it so it's super teeny.
Highly
Yeah.
sought after.
It's got like this whole like.
And an American going over there, you could buy one,
Mhm.
but to have a rabbi written scroll, it's going to cost you like 4 times as much as just buying a mezuzah.
Yeah, I'm just going to buy the $5 one. Hotel, you know? Come home and screw it to my apartment while no one's looking.
3 hamsters.
3 hamsters. Okay, so here's where I want to get back into, I got 3 minutes. We'll do this quick. When Yahweh your God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, to Jacob, to give you with great and good cities that you did not build, with houses full of all good things that you did not fill, and cisterns that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive trees that you did not plant, and when you eat and are full. If there are 2 verses in the Bible that, in my opinion, describe modern America better than any other, it's these 2. You are prosperous with things that you don't deserve.
You didn't build that.
I didn't build this church, right? So, when you enjoy all these blessings that God's going to give you that is so much more than what you deserved, than what you have worked for, then, and the word for that, by the way, is prosperity, then take care lest you forget Yahweh. So what does prosperity make us do? Forget Yahweh. And if there is a 3rd verse that describes America better than any other, it's this one.
It's a whole new meaning to prosperity gospel.
Totally. It totally is. Like God, why would prosperity gospel be a thing if like the ultimate result of it is forgetting Yahweh? Why would he do that? That would be the opposite of what he wants out of you. Anyways, and he says, you shall not go after other Elohim, the gods of the peoples who are around you, for Yahweh, your Elohim, is in your midst. In your midst is a jealous God, a jealous Elohim. Let the anger of Yahweh, your Elohim, be kindled against you. Lest. And he destroy you from the face of the earth. Don't put him to the test like you did at Massa. Diligently keep his commandments, his testimonies, his statutes. Do what is right and good in his sight, and it will go well with you, and you may go in and take possession of the good land that Yahweh swore to give to your fathers by thrusting out all of your enemies from before you, as Yahweh has promised. And when your son asks in time to come, what is the meaning of the law that we've been commanded? You say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt. Well, that's pretty cool. Yeah. Yahweh brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand, and Yahweh showed us signs and wonders and great and grievous against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes, and he brought us out from there that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. And Yahweh commanded us to do all these statutes to fear Yahweh our Elohim for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day, and it will be righteousness for us if we're careful to do all this commandment before Yahweh our God as he commanded us. Here's what I love about that. When your son asks you the purpose of the law, the thing that you need to tell him about is God's goodness and provision and protection and victory. All of those things are not what I associate at first glance with the Torah. When I think of the Torah, I think of all of this big old list. We like to say the Bible is not a list of do's and don'ts. It literally is. But I generally, like my first thoughts about what is the Torah, it's this big list of do's and don'ts. It's the 10 Commandments. It's how you worship God at the tabernacle. And if you make a bad sacrifice, you have to make another sacrifice to make up for it. The Day of Atonement and all these ways. But really, what the purpose of the law is God provided for us and protected us and brought us into this place, brought us out of Egypt, and shouldn't we then want to keep it? If you understand God's goodness, shouldn't we want to keep the law? Kind of leaves me in a place of legalism a little bit. If I'm totally honest. Till I remember that Jesus kept it for me, right? Jesus fulfilled the law so I don't have to. Yeah, so, cool.
But this goes back to Genesis as a prologue, and this is what was central. So
Yeah.
we went back to that again. It's all about the Exodus and a provider.
Gold
Right?
star. Yes.
Gold star. I got something
I love it. It's great. I'm out of time. Anything else before we close up? I'll send out an email tomorrow. Man, I don't know if I have anything to think about for the week. I'm just this is one of those passages that when I read it, I just I wish we had worship after. I just want to worship God now. You know what I mean? It's one of those studies where I'm just oh man, God is so good. So, okay, cool. Yeah.
Like the funny thing about that last part, that when your son asked, this is what you'll say to your son. When you read it, when you were reading it together, it came to me that's one of the rarest moments where it was so succinct and clear. You didn't have to try to figure out we were slaves. Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
And it's never that clear. I
No.
it's not. So anyway.
Deuteronomy 6 is amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Susan, do you want to pray for us? Thank you.
Gracious Lord, we just thank you so much for bringing us all here tonight. We thank you for the wisdom and the knowledge that you've given John so that he might be able to teach us all these very interesting and amazing things about you, Lord, that we probably wouldn't discover on our own just through reading. And thank you for the knowledge of the original languages and all the richness that is there and what you convey through that, Lord, through those who do study and know that. And I just praise you for everyone that's here, and I just pray that we all absorb what your Holy Spirit is teaching us and be able to put it into practice into our lives through your power in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Susan.